I thought that was awesome. My name is Joe Major. I am a part of the board of JAM and also the treasurer here in White River Junction, in Hartford, I should say, because if I just say White River Junction, I get dirty stares from everybody from Wilder and Queechee and such. Powerful documentary. I had the opportunity to see it on a plane going to San Diego, and when I got to San Diego, because it was one of my first times in San Diego, you have ideas of what San Diego is and how beautiful. You find out that this is in every major city in America. And so a lot of themes that we saw here, and we'll talk about that now. But I want to go and introduce the guests and the people who are really part of this symposium. Laura Di Piazza. She holds a Master's of Fine Arts in Interdisciplinary Arts and a focus on racial and social justice from Goddard College in Plainfield, Vermont. Laura teaches calligraphy. By the way, my handwriting is horrible, so you and I got to get together after this. Workshops at Dartmouth and the Society of Scribes in New York City. Laura's primary practice is creating conceptual and abstract art with a focus on social justice issues. She has exhibits works in the U.S., Canada, and Europe, and she resides in Harlem and Hanover. Andrew Winter is the executive director of Twin Pines Housing, a nonprofit developer and provider of affordable housing here in the Upper Valley. Over Andrew's 10-year tenure with Twin Pines, he's overseen significant growth in multifamily portfolio from 240 units to 565, and with over 150 units in various stages of development or redevelopment. Additionally, Twin Pines now has made possible 65 home ownerships units in the Upper Valley. I think that deserves a round of applause. Now, I'm going to say this about Andrew, and I'm also going to say this about Kenesha. They are lawyers, so please do not hold that against them. Please. Kenesha Jackson is a native of East St. Louis, Missouri. Excuse me, not Missouri, but Illinois. I always make that mistake, so forgive me. Who has combined her experience in business and law, and as a matter of fact, she has a business in the Upper Valley Aquatic Center. Blen, if you're ever in the Upper Valley Aquatic Center, please go. She has a smoothie bar in the Upper Valley, so please patron her, and then you can also join the Aquatic Center, which I'm the executive director of. Oh, by the way, her experience in business and law to fuel her passion and vision of transforming underserved communities. CJ relocated to the Northeast to pursue a law degree from Vermont Law in 2019. So please welcome our panelists. I guess right off the bat, and this is for anyone, how does, in your eyes, systemic racism, and I'm going to sit down here because I'm not going to stand for the whole thing, how does systemic racism affect housing in both urban and, because we live in a rural areas? Andrew?
Yeah, no, I grew up in Boston, so I saw firsthand, growing up there, the impact that systemic racism can have on communities. One of the most egregious examples, you kind of got a hint of it looking at that scene where they were looking at different perspectives in different communities and ways the walls are built. There was a picture in Miami of 95, And for those of you who know Boston, I-95 was supposed to go right through the center of Jamaica Plain and Roxbury and the South End. And one of the great community-wide efforts to kind of put the end to it, to put a foot down, was the folks in those neighborhoods coming together in the late 60s and early 70s and saying, no, we don't want that. And basically people power preventing a highway from going through the middle of their neighborhoods. And so that's something that I kind of grew up with as part of my experience as a city dweller. I will say, and I know we're going to touch on this a little bit later on, but we here in our community, we like to think that we're open and understanding and accepting of those who are different, and sometimes we are, and sometimes we're not. And sometimes people find ways to say, I don't want those people, I don't want them coming here. And I've, in my time at Twin Pines, have had people say, I'm concerned about you having that project, and people coming from a community in Massachusetts that is predominantly black and Latino, and moving to the Upper Valley. And I don't want that housing here because I'm worried about that. So we do see those kinds of things come up occasionally, and we really need to call them out. So I'll leave it there.
Kenesha, I'm going to go to you, but I'm going to say if you ask a question to Kenesha, she goes by CJ. And so I wanted to, and I apologize for not saying that right off the bat. So, CJ?
Thanks, Joe. So as Joe mentioned, I grew up in East St. Louis, Illinois. It's kind of confusing for a lot of people. But what really resonated with me in Racist Trees was the children, the scene with the children. And I was one of those kids. At the age of 7, I can remember in my community seeing a dilapidated, crumbled building. And it just stood there. It was there for years and years. And I'm thinking to myself, at 7, like, why? Who are the people who are supposed to fix this? Like, why is no one coming to fix this? And I think at that point I started to recognize that this was a bigger issue. It was more symbolic and representative of sort of what was taking place in my community, or the lack of disinvestment in the community. And I just kind of want to point that to, people as we think about black and brown people moving to this region. A lot of times people think that everyone can afford housing. I know housing is a big issue right now. My mother has never owned a house, by the way. And I think if she were to move here, she wouldn't be able to afford a house in this region. And so I know that there are a lot of young people, white families as well, who probably won't be able to own housing here. But I think we need to think about it too, as, black and brown people start to move to this area, and, they cannot afford homes here in this region. And so I take people to task. My thing is, how can we come up with creative ways to really solve this problem, as it manifests in housing? And so I think, everyone who's moving to this region, they're looking for quality homes. They're looking for a safe neighborhood. They're looking for places to raise their family. And so these issues are sort of following people as they move to other parts of the country. Thank you.
Laura, you have currently the opportunity to work and live in both a rural and an urban area. How do you see this?
Well, I've been up here for 15 years, and I have family in Harlem. I was born and raised in Brooklyn. So I see systemic racism show up in many ways. People could be racially profiled when filling out rental applications based on how their name, based on their current neighborhood, if it's predominantly brown or black. Some of you may have heard of a recent case of a Baltimore family that had received an appraisal for their home by a Maryland-based company that was just slightly higher than what they paid for, and they thought, something's not right here. You know, it was much lower than they expected. So as it turns out, the home is owned by Nathan Connolly and his wife, Shani Mott. Now, Dr. Connolly is a Johns Hopkins professor of history. And guess what he studies? Racial discrimination in the housing market. So he knew, like, he was like, something's going on here. So they got the low appraisal. They applied for to refinance their home, and they were denied the loan, which was not surprising. So I'll quote from the New York Times, actually covered this last August. And so I'll quote from this article about their experience. Months after their first appraisal, the couple applied for another refinance loan. They removed all their family photos. So could you imagine what they had to tell their kids? And they had a white male colleague, who's also a Johns Hopkins professor, stand in their place. So the second appraiser valued the home at $750,000. Their first appraiser valued it at $472,000. That's a $278,000 difference. Same home. So the black family walks the first appraiser through, and they receive that value. And then a white man walks the second appraiser through the same exact home, and it's almost $300,000. It's worth almost $300,000. So the article goes on to say that 97% of home appraisers are white, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and that the Biden administration announced in March 2022 that they have plans to reform an overhaul of the appraisal industry to dismantle systemic racism. So let's see if that happens.
Thank you, Laura.
2023.
I'm sorry?
This is still happening in
Yeah.
2023.
Yeah.
This audience is an audience that probably believes that there is systemic racism. But there is a segment of the population that does not believe it because it does not affect them. So obviously change is something that is slow moving, as we saw in the movie. How do we prove that these things are happening in 2023? CJ?
I think discussions like this, films like Racist Trees, I think we, in a way, need to use media to really show people. I always tell people, and it's just, so by the way, I do hear this a lot, from people in Vermont and elsewhere. They sort of think that the problem doesn't affect them, or it's not, something that they should be concerned about. And so I do hear that a lot from people, and they're just kind of like, well, CJ, I don't know why I should be concerned about that, And I said, well, we can't afford not to be concerned about it, because if we think about, issues like climate change or, future generations going out into the world, we're all more connected than we think. And so, I think that we really have to look at that and say, okay, we're interconnected. Our world is getting smaller and smaller, and this is impacting future generations. So, I mean, you can definitely use media to do that. I think, like I said, we need to have more conversations like this, and that's how we show people.
Andrew, you have states like Florida and other states that are literally changing history in their history books.
Yeah.
So to eradicate any notion that racism exists, how do we prevent that, one, in Vermont, and two, get the word out that it does exist, and there is a history of it, and it continues today.
Yeah, no, it does. And I mean, I think the situation in Florida with the changes proposed by the DeSantis administration to the curriculum around African American AP classes and the like, and really the larger issue of erasing Black history in the education system, because we don't want to make anybody feel bad, has to be called out. And we all have to take a stand when we see it. And I'll give another example, sort of what can go on here in the Upper Valley that maybe is a little bit closer to the movie in a way. And that was we were going through a permitting process a couple years back, and I had one small business owner sort of get up and say, "Why don't you just put the project down next to the landfill?" And that was kind of his answer for where the affordable housing project ought to go. And I was, I think, so taken aback. I was like, well, the good news is the federal government basically doesn't let us do what you're proposing. And that is the good news. In part because there used to be this notion, well, okay, just take that cheap land, put Black and brown people over there, put low-income people over there. The federal government did put in place laws that basically say, if you're going to use federal money, we're going to do what's called an environmental review. We're going to look and say, we're not going to put that housing next to the highway off-ramp. We're not going to put that housing next to the landfill or some dangerous site. And so, there are some protections in place, and it's important. And we've got to keep supporting those efforts, because occasionally, I think back to the years of the Trump administration, there are efforts to basically dismantle some of the fair housing laws, and we just need to say no.
Laura, I heard an audible gasp when I said I said that question. Can you tell me what that gasp was?
Well, I just had heard that apparently they're taking out that Rosa Parks was Black out of the textbooks in Florida. So maybe that's where that came from. When I think about the Upper Valley, I think of a lack of affordable housing, and I think the more people struggle to pay for housing, the more it will result in a homelessness crisis, which of course we have. I'm curious, has any folks here heard of the newly released Poverty by America by Matthew Desmond? Yep, okay, so he heads the eviction lab at Princeton. And in one of these press clips, it's him at a recent talk where he said, liberal communities are opposing affordable housing in their own communities at almost similar rates as conservative communities. Yeah, so we need to really look at this notion of not in my backyard. We are clearly criminalize poverty. And to just segregate people because they're poor doesn't work. We have to integrate folks into our communities. So that's what I hope to see in the Upper Valley more of. I know there's a lot of good people like you, Andrew, doing this work.
Yeah, so I want to touch on the term affordable housing, because I sort of take issue with this term of art. And the reason why I take issue with it is because I grew up in affordable housing. I grew up in the projects. And if you actually Google that term of art, affordable housing, you'll see that there's negative terms associated, synonyms associated with that. And so I'm very cautious in using that term, because it really sort of, I think disenfranchises people even more, marginalizes people even more. And so I think in some way. I mean, I'm going to be a pioneer in sort of trying to change or shift, how we talk about housing. But that word, to me, we have to come up with a new word. I've heard others, attainable housing, things like that. But you can look it up, you can Google it, and, cheap housing is a synonym that's associated with that. So I do really take issue with that word, and I use it cautiously.
Andrew, how does real estate contribute to inequity?
So the average American household has about 26% of its net worth tied up in the real estate it owns. And what we see in America is a huge disparity between black ownership and white ownership. 42% for black Americans and 74% home ownership for white Americans. So huge disparities there, and we see it, we see huge disparities between households that, the average homeowner has a net worth of $300,000. The average renter, I think it's like $8,000, something, maybe it's $13,000 in the last I checked. So huge disparity. So, housing is, and we see it with those homeowners in this movie, where they're looking at a $75,000 to $100,000 increase, or 75 to 100% increase in the value of their properties, and that is huge. And being able to pass that on is a huge leg up for them and their children, and that's something that we want to encourage and something we want to celebrate.
Laura, that real estate passed down is contributing to generational wealth, which people of color haven't had access to.
Exactly.
How do we do that?
Right. Well, first I want to thank Samantha Davison Green for inviting me to exhibit Redlining Our Souls. I've been thinking about, why this huge difference in home ownership and generational wealth, especially after reading Ta-Nehisi Coates' The Case for Reparations.
Can I stop for a
Yeah.
second?
Yeah.
By the way,
Yeah.
I'm a graduate of Howard University, and he went to Howard. So every time you mention Howard, I gotta say something about Howard. Every single time.
That's true.
I apologize.
That's cool, Joe. No, that's awesome. So this was an amazing essay published in The Atlantic, June 2014, and he talked with Chicago resident Clyde Ross, whose family unfortunately fell victim to predatory lending, because with redlining, there was no opportunity for black folks to get a mortgage. It's like, how are you going to do it? And there were like these weird, convoluted workarounds. So I recommend that essay, and also The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. And it's an excellent book, and the Norwich Bookstore is offering, I believe, a discount for this month. So if you don't have it, consider requesting it at your library as well. So, of course, I think about redlining. That's what my exhibit downstairs at JAM, Redlining Our Souls, focuses on. So in 1934, the Federal Housing Administration was created out of the New Deal. It was Depression-era housing crisis, and they needed to address it. But one thing that the FHA did was they heavily subsidized mass-produced subdivisions in the suburbs, but with the stipulation that it was white only. Okay, so that was like a huge setback, because that was a lot of housing that black Americans could not participate in, right? So in 1933, the federally sponsored Home Owners Loan Corporation was established, and their initial goal was to prevent foreclosures. However, By the late 1930s, they were creating these residential security maps, also known as redlining maps. These maps were color-coded, and grade D was the lowest grade you could get, and it was in red, and that's usually where black folks were, or certain newly arrived Europeans. So there were some white folks who couldn't get mortgages too, but that did not last because the next generation assimilated, and they were able to get not only mortgages, but also homeowners insurance that you need, just people selling to you. There were real estate brokers who would just not sell homes to black folks in certain areas. It just was not happening. So yes, as it turns out, there are no redlining maps in Vermont and Maine, and only one in New Hampshire, Manchester. There's some other states that don't have it. So it's mainly metropolitan areas that were issued these redlining maps. What else can I say about this? Well, it really set the tone for the 20th century about who can and who cannot own homes in this country. So it does explain a lot.
CJ, go ahead, CJ.
Sorry, I just have to add to this too, because I've thought about it extensively, so much to the point where when I came to law school, I actually worked on starting my own real estate development company, and it's Addison Development Group, that's the name of it. And I don't think real estate itself is the issue. I think that there is this thing in America where we don't recognize that it's kind of like the gentleman said from the Brookings Institute, that all of a sudden, white people were able to acquire all this wealth or have this wealth. And it's like, no, there were programs and governmental grants and things like that were issued so that white people can, design their communities in a way where it promoted healthy living and safe living and, just beautiful city living. And so I think those are some of the things that we have to recognize. And then also, stop looking at black people or the communities and saying, oh, because, something happened, it's sort of the issue of the black people who live in those communities, black and brown people. No, this is a systemic issue. This was designed. These communities were cut off from living, a prosperous, sort of productive life in American society. And so I think that for me, it's really about, having more real estate developers who are people of color, who are, I'd say, women, real estate developers as well. And then looking at it from sort of like an allyship standpoint, sort of like with what Andrew's doing, sort of how can we focus and have these conversations to bring us all together to collaborate and understanding that this is an issue and we all have a stake in this.
So anyone that knows me knows I generally talk a lot and I take up the oxygen in a room. So I'm going to open it up to questions in the audience. And I saw a hand in the back row.
And I'm going to walk a microphone around so we can get your question on the recording.
So I had two comments and questions. One is there were two things that were really convicting to me about the film, which, by the way, the film was awesome. The first thing was the smugness of Mr. Roberts in Palm Springs, and I fear that we could be accused of the same thing, that we sit here very happy and contented in our liberal politics, and maybe completely oblivious and blind to some of the things that we participate in. And aligned to that, and I guess I would just sort of like to hear from CJ and Laura about maybe if that is indeed some of their experience here. And then the second question I would have that it was aligned to that was the commentary that until a white man raised this issue and really did treat it like it was a new issue rather than, and took a lot of ownership. He wanted to be the one to speak when the town folk came and all that. So what it is that we might do that would empower, and Andrew, I think you could speak to this, empower the communities themselves to make demand to power and have that demand heard effectively.
Let's go Laura first.
Sure. Wow, up here, I don't, I want to maybe not talk too much about my opinions of the Upper Valley, which are mainly actually positive. But as a multiracial Black woman, I've had a $10 bill counterfeit checked. I've been followed in stores. But I've also been treated very well and have had some opportunities here. I have actually, okay, I won't go in too much into it, but moving on maybe to the movie, we have to be very careful of the white savior complex that some people have, who their intention, of course, is to help, which is great. And with Trey Daniel, it's his presence made a difference. There's no doubt about that. And I sadly, it was necessary because no one was listening to the Black folks for decades. So, if you can use your white privilege to help, but also in partnership, I had learned of this nonprofit in Hawaii called Share Your Mana. And in Hawaiian mana is it could be your power, your spiritual energy, right? And I saw this meeting they had, and all the people talking were either homeless or were recently homeless. And what blew me away was that they were asking people who were affected what they thought, as opposed to other people saying this is what you need. Someone was saying, look, a charging station would be nice, some place to take, just basic things. And it was so refreshing to see, folks being listened to, right? Partnership, I think, is so much more effective than someone coming in and being, let me tell you how this should go down. So there are a lot of amazing white folks up here who are, of course, against housing discrimination, continue to ask folks who are affected by it. And it's not only BIPOC folks, it's poor white folks, what they need.
Thank you, Laura. CJ?
Hi, Allison. Thank you for that question. Good question. So what really took me, or I guess what caught my attention was you heard multiple times or maybe a few times of the people in the community discussing how there was this failure to see them as human beings. And that was really hard to hear because I think a lot of Black people and brown people may feel that way. But let me just say this about this specific region. I feel okay, so there is some smugness that exists, but that exists everywhere, right? But what I'd say about this particular area, if there is smugness, I don't think it's intentional. I think that the people here are good-hearted. And I'm not saying that because I'm sitting in front of you and I'm afraid. No, I'm very outspoken. I think Allison knows this. I know I'm not afraid to speak. But I think there is a level of ignorance. I think that is what exists. And I think that people sort of just don't know what they don't know. I tell people all the time, and you saw FDR in there, it was this moment when his wife actually, Eleanor, took him to see how people were living in New York in the slums. And he sort of looked at it and he said, wow, I didn't know people were living this way. And then from there you saw the New Deal and other government programs that respond as a result of him seeing how people were living. So I think there's a lack of, there's ignorance, there's comfortability here. People in Vermont are super fortunate to have a community like this. I think we watched a great video movie before this, and you saw the beauty of the community and people coming together. And I was commenting to a friend about how people are super caring about the environment and the land here and how people are, sort of living. And so I think that here in this region, you see that, but outside of it, I don't know if people are really able to connect the dots, and they sort of move back here and they're just like, oh yeah, I've lived in Connecticut and I saw, Hartford or New Haven, and it's like, oh, but I'm going back to Vermont. But I think also too, people really don't know what to do about it. It's like, I think everybody, like, people are outraged. They're really like, what do we do about this? How do we solve this issue? And so I think that we have to sort of step up as a society, as humans, and say, okay, hey, we're here today. Okay, we know these things happened in the past, but we're here today. How do we step up, stand up, and solve this problem together?
Andrew?
We have.
I was starting to think about some of the smugness that we have here, and I'm remembering back. So is it District 14? Yep, District 14, Section 14. Thank you. I guess I'm getting into the Hunger Games or something like that. So Section 14, one of the things that stood out, not just the quality of the housing, but the fact that people didn't have indoor plumbing. And I think, one of the things that we take for granted in our region, and I think we take for granted in America, is that everybody has access to indoor plumbing. There are 450,000 homes in America that do not have access to reliable indoor plumbing, either because they're connected to failed septic systems or cesspools, or just don't have access at all. And that is in significant parts of the country. It's in Indian country. It is in the colonias along the Texas, Arizona, Mexico border regions. It's in Appalachia. It's in the Delta, Mississippi Delta. Those are parts of the country that just have suffered from historic disinvestment. And we've all got work to do to advocate for housing dollars, for infrastructure, to make sure that everybody's got access to clean water and a sanitary system that works. Here in the Upper Valley, I guess we can all do more. We can all stand up and say to our communities, we think housing is important, and sometimes that means infrastructure, and it means, thinking about opportunities. I live in Norwich. I keep thinking, I got to get Norwich to do more housing, right? I got a sewer. And that is one of the things. And there are folks, even though it is the most liberal town in the most liberal state in the entire United States in many ways, Norwich is slow to embrace it. And sewer is part of it. It helps make multifamily housing possible. And I'll Well, we can talk about that, and we'll talk about impediments to housing, and our criminal justice system is part of that discussion. So with that nugget out there, I'll turn it over to Joe.
We got lots of questions, and Jordan's been waiting here. We see all your hands. Let's make sure we get to everybody.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, hello. I have a question that it's something that I grapple with constantly, and I'm trying to find the answer to. And I was happy because I felt like they started to address it in the film. I think it was like chapter 4, but then it didn't really get the attention that I wanted. But I get that it's a documentary; it's got to be focused. So I was hoping to ask you, and I will always take the opportunity to pick the brains of people smarter than me. So my question is, like, when talking about like building inclusive communities and like how do we move forward. How can we have these, like, I don't know, discussions and questions about land ownership and aesthetics and who has the right to do what without taking in, like, the fact that none of this land is ours to begin with, which I think gives you, like you can get into, like, a greater conversation about ownership in general and, like, why we think it's okay to, like, own the earth. I don't know. But if we are, like, going down that road, then this land was not owned by us and was, there's a huge history there of state-sanctioned violence, and taking that away. So when we're thinking about like how do we move forward and how do we build these communities, to me it feels like it's pointless without taking that into consideration. So I'm just curious, like, what do you see as like a way to reconcile this, or how do we bring that aspect of the conversation into our decisions? Like, I'm a pretty staunch land backer, but I'm curious, like, what maybe if these are conversations you're having or thinking about.
Laura, do you want to grapple with that?
Yeah, I think I will pass. I'm sorry. It's such a
Okay.
good question.
Andrew?
Yeah, the question of how we use the land, how we think about the land, I mean, one of the things that I, in sort of thinking through the issues you raise, have grappled with is opportunity for communities, and around things like, we have state policies which push housing, rightly or wrongly, into certain communities where there's water and sewer. And we may say that makes sense to have housing where there's water and sewer in village centers, but it means that we're relying on towns like Windsor and Hartford and Randolph, Bradford, to have much of the affordable workforce housing in our region. And is that always what we want? Are there opportunities that we're missing to kind of make sure that every community has a place for everyone, and provide opportunities everywhere for people? And so that's something that I think we all have to think about. I don't have answers. I'm simply raising the questions.
CJ, did you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I love that question so much. I actually did my final research paper in law school on that specific topic about just the land itself being taken away from the natives, and then sort of, I guess this thing of, white settlers coming in and sort of saying, oh, we own this land, and sort of even how that is, dates back to pre-colonialism and, colonialism. And I think there was a case that I read that said something like, whoever possesses the land, they own the laws of the land, something like that, right? And so at the time when the natives did have the land and it was theirs, they were sort of, in a way, very giving and, harmonious toward the people who were there. And then all of a sudden the land was taken, and they didn't have the rights to their land, and they couldn't make the laws. And so I think that, from that standpoint, there has to be sort of this recognition of the fact that this occurred. I think a lot of people know this. And so, where do we go from there? Again, I mean, we're here today. We're having this conversation sitting here in this room. I know there are individuals here where there are all these sorts of initiatives in Vermont where people own like massive amounts of land. And do you really need all of that land? And how can we contribute to more housing in here? Or, does there need to be some conversation about, sort of giving away some of this land so that we can make it possible for others to have housing here? I think there are all kind of things that we can do. I think, again, we just need to put on our creative hats and sort of have these conversations.
Thank you, CJ.
So, sorry, we got one over here, and then I'm going to run right over there. See you all.
So in the summer of 2019, my family and I moved here to the Upper Valley. I'm come to visit here since 15 years. My in-laws are living in West Lebanon, and so in 2019, we made our move over from Oregon to the Upper Valley, and it was impossible to find housing from the distance. So we asked our in-laws, can you scope out the situation here and find us some housing possibly? And they did find a landlord who renovated housing up in West Lebanon. And my father-in-law, who's very well known in the community, he was the executive director of Romano Circle and has been very involved in the community. So he found somebody, and they said, oh yeah, they can have the housing. It will be ready in 8 weeks. We're just refinishing like some upgrades. And my father-in-law went over there, then my husband went over there and looked at it, and then I showed up. And I showed up and checked out the house out, and I was like, oh, this is great, this is lovely, happy to meet you, landlords. And then they started ghosting us. They just faded away, And if you want a name to put them on the evil list of landlords of the Upper Valley, I'm happy to provide that to you. But what do you do in a situation like that? It's like discrimination, right? It's like what you experience. They're not calling you out, calling you the N-word, right? It's just like, hey, hang on. Like, everything was okay, and then I show up, and then y'all acting weird. What do you do? It's like I haven't done anything about it because, like, you put it in your basket of like things that don't acknowledge because, like, it just hurts too much if you always have these experiences,
I'm going to go to the lawyers on the panel first. So I'll start with CJ.
That is such a loaded. Here's the deal, though. So I'm sorry that even happened to you, because it happens to so many people. I'm always fearful that it's going to happen to me. And honestly, I really don't know if it's happened to me or not. It's kind of like they were saying in Racist Trees. Sometimes you can't prove these things. It's really difficult to prove, right? And then people thinking you're insane, and because you're bringing these issues up, and sometimes it's not until a white person says something. And then what I even noticed more so in the Racist Trees documentary was that I think that the town didn't want to call it racism, or the fact that the trees were erected. I don't think they wanted to say that it was actually racist, because when you start getting into that, right, there are all kind of like legal issues that sort of take place. People are suing because of these racist racial practices, and then also the town sort of saying, well, we can't really prove that this exists. That's neither here nor there, but I'm like, yeah, put them on the list, the bad list, if there's such a list that exists. But then, like, who's really advocating or paying attention to this list, right? Like, so it's unfortunate that it happens, and it still happens today. Yeah, I don't.
Andrew?
Yeah, I'm to follow up on what CJ was saying, I'm sorry for your situation, and that's one where I would hire a good lawyer, and I say that as a former recovering lawyer, because sometimes you do need somebody to help take your side, and ultimately, filing a complaint with the state is another option as well. The Civil Rights Office in the state of New Hampshire, because that's the only way you're going to hold people accountable, and frankly, sometimes people need to be held accountable.
But Andrew, can I push back on that a little bit?
Yep.
So the reason why I want to push back on that is because in this country, black and brown people have not often felt like they were represented by lawyers in the proper way, or either they may not have been able to afford lawyers. I know that today you have services like legal aid where you can get free representation. But I think that there's this natural opposition to the law itself and to legal help on the account of black people. And the fact that we got, so many other issues that are going on in our lives. I've heard so many people say, oh, well, why don't you just get a lawyer? And I'm like, where do I get the time to focus on this specific issue every single day, bird dog it, you know what I mean? I'm dealing with, oppression, trying to I guess raise my family, my daughter up into a way where she can sort of benefit, and then not have to grow up how I grew up, so.
Thank you. My question is two-part, and it's for Andrew. So CJ made a really good point about affordable housing. I also grew up in the projects. I'm not from New England at all. I'm from Seattle, so very much know what that looks like, and I have had the opportunity to be in some quote-unquote affordable housing in the Upper Valley, and very much looks like the projects I grew up, corkboard cabinets, cracked bathtubs, thin linoleum, thin walls, single pan windows. So my first part of my question is, how does Twin Pines avoid having neighborhoods that are coined as the ghetto or the projects. And my second part is that Laura made a great point about bringing people to the table who are utilizing these facilities. So does Twin Pines access current residents and residents of the community who are living in these places to consult on upcoming projects, and what does that look like?
Yeah, great question. So we're a little bit different than a lot of other nonprofits. A third of our board are low and moderate income households. So we try to bring folks to the table at the highest level so that we're including residents both in our ownership and in our rental properties to kind of provide input, hold our feet to the fire, make sure that we're building high quality stuff. Our projects that we're building now, super energy efficient. We're trying to strive to make them energy efficient, both from a comfort perspective, but also from an environmental perspective, and reduce our carbon footprint. So, the stuff that we're building is among the nicest stuff in the Upper Valley. That said, there are things that I wish I could fix in some of the older properties. Sometimes I'm finding myself in our organization having to acquire properties, not necessarily knowing, to preserve them so that we keep this affordable stock and we don't lose it. That there was 100 units over in Lebanon that was a risk of being lost as affordable housing a few years ago. We stepped up to buy it. Then we're having to renovate it and trying to find the resources at the federal level when often it's completely inadequate. Federal government, when we bought that 100 units, the U.S. Department of Agriculture was putting $35 million a year into preserving that housing stock. There were 440,000 units across the country of this particular housing stock in $35 million. So it's sometimes trying to figure out ways to do that, and we've been successful. But it's constant reinvestment, and I think that's hopefully what we're doing. So,
Thank you. Let's go one more question.
For anyone on the panel, are there movements, reparations movements, which are directly related to housing? In other words, that housing or land or monetary would be linked to the returning of the resources for housing that was taken away. So are there any reparations related to housing that you're aware of?
Are you aware of it?
No, that's such a good question. I think there's something happening. It's in San Francisco, but in this region, not that I know of, and I hope so. I mean, that would make sense.
Andrew?
I was going to say, there was a note at the end of the movie about Section 14 and trying to make reparations or looking at the possibility of reparations. I'd be interested to hear how that went.
CJ?
Yeah, so there's a community, it's actually in Elgin, Illinois, where I don't know this individual, but apparently she went to school and a friend of mine knows her, but she sort of advocated on behalf of the community to sort of seek out reparations because of harms that have occurred, marginalizing communities, are people of color. And so they were actually able or successful in getting reparations. So, yeah.
First of all, I want to thank you for all coming and singing. And I also want to say that Wrif is now a part of JAM. And so when you come and see these just wonderful, wonderful films, please know that it is part of JAM, the new name of CATV, if you didn't know that. And thank you so much for coming. And let's work to move forward. Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, CJ.
And thank you, Joe. And just to plug, we have one last film for the festival at 6 o'clock tonight. Come on back if you are able. Thank you.